There are moments in a courtroom that change the temperature of the room. Not figuratively, literally. Something shifts in the air. The way people sit, the way they breathe, the way the silence between words suddenly carries more weight than the words themselves. I've spent years studying these moments, reading transcripts, reviewing records, understanding the architecture of how professional and legal proceedings unfold when the person at the center of them has spent their entire career believing the proceedings would never apply to them. What I'm about to tell you is about one of those moments, and the man who created it, not by accident, not by emotion he couldn't control, but by a choice that was, somehow, the product of an intelligence that should have known better. His name was Dr. Harlan Mercer, and the moment he chose is the kind that ends careers. But to understand why that moment landed the way it did, you need to understand who Harlan Mercer was before he walked into that room. He was 56 years old, a cardiothoracic surgeon, the kind of specialty that places a person at the very top of a professional hierarchy that is already populated entirely by people who have climbed extraordinary distances. The surgical suite is one of the most stratified environments in modern professional life. At its center, surrounded by a team whose primary function is to support and respond to his decisions, stands the attending surgeon. And in that position, for 23 years, Harlan Mercer had operated. His outcomes were strong. His resume was exceptional. He had trained at institutions whose names carry weight, published in journals that other surgeons read to stay current, and built a private practice that charged fees reflecting the fact that people who could afford him generally wanted him specifically. He was not a famous surgeon in the way that produces television appearances, but he was renowned in the smaller, more professionally significant way, the way that means other surgeons know your name and use it approvingly in conversations you never hear. He was also, by the account of nearly everyone who had worked under him, extremely difficult. Not in ways that showed up in formal complaints easily. The formal complaint process, as anyone who has worked in a hospital system can tell you, is navigated by people with power more easily than by people without it. What showed up instead was in the texture of working environments he created. Nurses who dreaded his service days, residents who worked twice as hard and with half the confidence when he was in the room. An OR culture that senior staff described, in carefully worded terms, as high pressure, in ways that didn't always track with clinical necessity. He interrupted people mid-sentence. He asked questions in tones that were designed to expose rather than inform. He had a particular habit, commented on by multiple staff members over many years, of addressing nurses by their job title rather than their name, even nurses he had worked alongside for a decade, not as a formal courtesy, as a signal about the structure of the room and where each person in it ranked. His patients knew a different version of him. With patients, he was composed, measured, authoritative, in the way that instills confidence. He understood that patients were clients as well as patients, and he treated the client-facing version of his practice with appropriate care. This is not unusual. Many brilliant surgeons have learned that the professional persona that works with patients is not the one that comes naturally in other contexts. The distinction matters because it tells you something about the behavior that followed. It was not impulsive. It was not the product of someone who had poor social judgment across all contexts. It was the product of someone who chose, deliberately, when and where to deploy his contempt. And somewhere in the calculus of who deserved his best behavior and who could absorb his worst, he had placed a medical board hearing in the wrong column. The proceedings before the state medical board had been triggered by a specific complaint. A former resident, Dr. Elena Ruiz, 29 years old, in her final year of surgical training, had filed a formal account with the hospital's Patient Safety and Professional Conduct Office. Her account described a series of incidents in the operating room, specific instances where Dr. Mercer had responded to her questions or minor errors with sustained verbal criticism during active procedures, in terms she described as demeaning, in front of the full surgical team, with patients on the table under anesthesia. She described one incident in particular. A procedure where she had made a minor technical error, the kind, she noted, that attending surgeons make as well, and which had no adverse effect on the patient's outcome. Dr. Mercer had stopped the procedure, turned to her, and in a voice audible to every person in the room, said that she had no business holding instruments in a surgical field, and that he would personally ensure her training program was aware of the standard she was performing at. Then he had continued the operation. The patient recovered fully. The outcome was excellent. The file, to anyone reviewing it for clinical markers, would have looked like a successful procedure. Elena Ruiz had gone to the locker room after her shift, changed out of her scrubs, and sat in her car for 45 minutes before driving home. She had been in surgical training for 6 years at that point. She had survived the physics of medical school, residency, fellowship. She was not a fragile person, but she was a person, and what had happened in that room had been done to her as a person, in front of colleagues who would need to evaluate and be evaluated by her for the remainder of her training. She filed the complaint. It took her 3 weeks to do it because she understood, with the clarity of someone who had watched this environment function for years, that filing the complaint would cost her something regardless of outcome. That assessment proved correct in some ways and less correct in others, which we'll return to. The complaint triggered an investigation by the hospital's conduct committee, which referred the matter to the state medical board after its own review, found the account credible, and identified corroborating statements from 2 nurses and another resident who had been present for various incidents. The medical board opened formal proceedings. Dr. Mercer was represented by counsel, an experienced medical defense attorney named Robert Haynes, who had navigated medical board proceedings many times and who clearly understood what the situation required. Haynes, by all accounts, had advised his client carefully. He had explained that medical board panels are composed of professionals who take their role seriously, that the evidence in this case was documented and corroborated, and that the path forward required his client to demonstrate accountability and a commitment to change. He had, apparently, believed he was being understood. The hearing panel was chaired by Dr. Sylvia Morrow, a former neurosurgeon who had moved into medical administration and regulatory work 12 years prior. She was 61 years old. She had the particular quality of a person who has made very difficult decisions under very high pressure for a very long time and has arrived, on the other side of that experience, at a composure that is neither performed nor fragile. She ran the panel with a kind of economy that experienced practitioners recognize: no wasted motion, no wasted words, precise attention to what was actually in front of her. She had seen these hearings before. She had seen the range of how physicians responded to the formal process of being held accountable: the contrite, the defensive, the genuinely remorseful, the strategically cooperative, the quietly furious. She had seen all of them, and she had developed over time a particular sensitivity to the moments when a respondent decided, consciously or not, that they were the wrong kind of person to be sitting in the chair they were sitting in. The hearing opened with procedural formalities. The panel was introduced. The charges were read. Dr. Mercer sat beside Robert Haynes and maintained, through the opening portion, an expression that Haynes had apparently worked to shape: neutral, attentive, appropriately serious. He had coached his client, by all visible evidence, on what the situation required. The complainant's attorney presented Elena Ruiz's account. Elena was present and testified. She was direct, specific, and methodical, the product perhaps of her training, which had taught her to describe clinical situations precisely and without embellishment. She described dates. She described what was said. She described the silence that followed in the OR after Dr. Mercer spoke. She described sitting in her car for 45 minutes. She was cross-examined by Robert Haynes. His questions were professional. He explored inconsistencies in the timeline, asked about context, raised the clinical pressure of the environment as relevant to how communication might be interpreted. It was competent work, It did not significantly damage Elena's account, but it was the right thing to do. During Elena's testimony, Dr. Mercer's expression changed. Not dramatically, not in a way that the camera, had there been one, would have captured as a single identifiable moment, but in the incremental way that faces change when a person is processing something that conflicts sharply with their internal narrative. His jaw tightened. His eyes moved from Elena to the panel and back. At one point, he wrote something on the legal pad in front of him with the kind of pressure that people apply to pens when they are trying to contain something they are not containing very well. The panel heard from the corroborating witnesses. Both nurses confirmed the specific incident Elena had described. Their accounts were consistent with hers in the material details and added texture she hadn't provided. One of them described the way the rest of the surgical team had gone very still after Dr. Mercer spoke. She said, "Everyone just kept working. We didn't look at each other. You learn not to look at each other." The second resident who had provided a statement was not present in person. Their contribution was submitted in writing, with a note that they were concerned about professional retaliation. The panel chair noted the written submission, acknowledged the concern embedded in the note without editorializing, and moved on. At this point, approximately 90 minutes into the proceedings, Dr. Mercer leaned toward Robert Haynes and whispered something. Haynes listened, said something brief in return, and Dr. Mercer settled back into his chair. Whatever was said, it appeared to represent a temporary management of something rather than a resolution of it. The panel moved to questioning of Dr. Mercer directly. This is the portion of the hearing where everything that followed became possible. Dr. Morrow asked him to describe, in his own words, his understanding of the incidents that had been reported. He spoke clearly and in complete sentences, which was consistent with his intelligence and his professional training. He said that the operating room was a high-stakes environment that required directness. He said that standards in surgical training were appropriately demanding. He said that he had always held himself to a high standard and expected the same from those he supervised. He said that in retrospect, he could see that his communication style might have been experienced as harsh by someone who was, and here he paused slightly, in a way that was impossible to fully interpret, less accustomed to the demands of that environment. Dr. Morrow listened. She made a note. She asked a follow-up question. She asked whether he believed the incidents described by Dr. Ruiz, specifically the incident during the active procedure, reflected an appropriate exercise of the teaching responsibilities that come with an attending surgeon's role. He said that a surgical supervisor has an obligation to correct errors when they occur, and that he stood by his decision to address the issue directly. She asked whether he believed addressing a resident in those terms, during an active procedure, in front of the full team, was consistent with the professional standards the board expected from attending physicians. He said that he believed his conduct had been within the range of accepted practice. Dr. Morrow wrote something down. The room was quiet. The quality of that quiet was the kind that experienced practitioners know to pay attention to. She asked one more question. She asked whether, in reflecting on this process and hearing Dr. Ruiz's account today, there was anything he wished he had done differently. The question was, in the language of these hearings, a door, not a trick, not a trap. A door that people who understand what they're doing walk through with something recognizable as accountability, because the panel needs to see whether that capacity is present. It's the most important question in the room, and it's asked plainly enough that the only way to miss it is to choose not to see it. He paused for a moment. Then he said that he had given decades of his professional life to the highest standards of patient care, and that he found it difficult to accept that a single complaint from a resident who had struggled to meet the requirements of his service was being treated as grounds for a formal proceeding of this nature. Robert Haynes closed his eyes briefly and opened them again. Dr. Morrow placed her pen on the table. She looked at Dr. Mercer for a moment. Then she said, "Doctor, I want to make sure I understand your answer. Are you saying that the complaint brought by Dr. Ruiz and corroborated by 2 additional witnesses reflects primarily the complainant's difficulty meeting clinical standards rather than your conduct in that surgical suite? He said that he was saying that context mattered and that the panel should have a complete picture. She said, "The panel has heard from 4 witnesses and reviewed documentation spanning 14 months. We have a complete picture. What I'm asking is whether you take any personal accountability for the conduct described." There was a pause. In the transcript of this hearing, the pause is marked by the recorder as approximately 6 seconds of silence. 6 seconds is a long time to sit in silence in a formal proceeding while a panel chair waits for your answer. He said, "I take accountability for pursuing the highest standard in my operating room." It was at this moment that something shifted in Dr. Mercer's posture. The management that Robert Haynes had apparently worked to install, the neutral expression, the attentive stillness, began to come apart in a specific way. He straightened. He placed both hands on the table in front of him. He looked at Dr. Morrow with an expression that people who were present would later describe in similar terms, like someone who had decided they were done being patient with a process they considered beneath them. He said, "I think I should say directly that this panel is not qualified to evaluate what happens in a surgical suite. None of you have stood at a table with a patient's chest open and made the decisions I make. I've spent 23 years performing at the highest level of this profession, and I am sitting here being lectured about communication standards by administrators." He said the word administrators with a precision that removed any ambiguity about what he meant by it. The room went still, not the charged stillness of before, a different kind, the stillness of people who have just watched something happen that cannot be undone. Robert Haynes put down his pen. Dr. Morrow looked at Dr. Mercer for a long moment. Her expression did not change in any dramatic way. She didn't flush or tighten. She simply looked at him with the composure of a person for whom composure is not an effort. She said, "Thank you, doctor." Then she turned to the panel and said the hearing would recess for 15 minutes. What happened during those 15 minutes, the panel did not narrate publicly. These are professional proceedings, not trials. The deliberation is internal. But what happened after those 15 minutes is a matter of record. When the panel reconvened, Dr. Morrow read a statement. She said that the panel had found, by unanimous decision, that the conduct described in the complaint and corroborated by witnesses constituted unprofessional behavior that violated the standards the board maintained for physician conduct in teaching environments. She said the panel had further found, based on the respondent's statements during the hearing, including his characterization of this process and of the panel itself, that there was no evidence of the insight or accountability that the board required to have confidence that the conduct would not recur. She said the panel was imposing an immediate suspension of Dr. Harlan Mercer's medical license, pending completion of a structured remediation program, an independent psychological evaluation, and a supervised re-entry process that would include direct observation of his conduct in clinical teaching settings. She said that if those requirements were met, a path to reinstatement existed, but that path was not guaranteed and would be evaluated at a future hearing. She said all of this in the same measured, economical voice she had used throughout the proceeding. No added weight, no performance of gravity. The gravity was already there, contained in the words themselves. Dr. Mercer did not speak. Robert Haynes did not speak. The room processed what had just happened in the way that rooms do. The subtle collective recalibration of people who have witnessed something unexpected reach its conclusion. Later, Robert Haynes would say, in a statement he issued on his client's behalf, that the decision was being reviewed and that his client maintained that he had served patients with distinction throughout his career. Both of those things were true. The decision was being reviewed, and he had served patients with distinction. The two things were not in contradiction, which is something worth sitting with for a moment. A surgeon can have excellent outcomes and also be the reason a resident sat in a car for 45 minutes trying to process what had been done to them in front of colleagues. Excellence in one dimension of a role doesn't purchase unlimited credit in another. The operating table and the teaching environment are both real. Both have people in them who deserve to be treated as people. Elena Ruiz completed her residency. The timeline is what it is. The process took the time it took, and her training continued through it. She matched into a fellowship program at an institution in another city. She has not publicly commented on the outcome of the hearing beyond confirming that she was grateful the process worked as it was designed to work. That phrase, worked as it was designed to work, carries a particular weight from someone who understood, when she filed the complaint, that it might not. The thing that stays with me from this case is not the suspension itself. Suspensions happen. Licenses are sanctioned. Remediation processes are initiated. Careers are paused or ended for a range of reasons across the medical profession. The mechanics of that are important, but not, in themselves, unusual. What stays with me is the question Dr. Morrow asked, the one about what he wished he had done differently. The door that was opened plainly and directly in language that required no interpretation. He didn't walk through it. And the reason he didn't walk through it is not, I think, that he couldn't see it. He was a man of considerable intelligence who had navigated complex environments for 23 years. He saw the door. He chose not to use it because using it would have required him to experience himself as someone who had been wrong in a way that mattered. Not clinically, not technically, but in the dimension of how he treated the people around him. And that experience was, apparently, more than he was willing to have. The word administrators, the way it landed in the room, that was not an accident. It was a choice, a message delivered with precision by a man who had spent decades at the top of a hierarchy and wanted, in that moment more than anything else, for the panel to know that he saw them as below him. What he didn't fully account for, what perhaps he had never had to account for in the smaller rooms he had operated in for 23 years, was that the panel had the authority to respond. Not with anger, not with a matching display of contempt, with a unanimous decision and a statement read in the same measured voice the chair had been using all morning. Composure is not passivity. That's the lesson Dr. Morrow embodied without stating it. She didn't need to raise her voice to make her authority felt. She didn't need to perform. She simply documented what had happened, reached a conclusion that the evidence supported, and read it aloud. That's what real authority looks like. It doesn't need to announce itself. It doesn't need to establish hierarchy in the room. It holds the room by the quality of its attention and the precision of its decisions. Harlan Mercer had operated in rooms where his authority was architectural, built into the structure of the space, the chain of command, the title above the door. In those rooms, his authority required nothing from him. It was simply present. Sylvia Morrow's authority was different in kind. It came from the precision of her questions, the patience of her listening, the exactness of her response to what she had actually heard. It was not built into the room. It was built into her, and that kind of authority does not diminish when someone directs contempt at it. It observes the contempt. It notes it. It incorporates it into the record, and then it reads its decision. The remediation process that was mandated carries its own story, though that story is ongoing and not yet resolved. What is resolved is the hearing itself, the testimony, the question that was asked, and the answer that was given. The 6 seconds of silence marked in the transcript, the word administrators and the stillness that followed it. What is also resolved is that Elena Ruiz's account is part of the permanent record of the State Medical Board. Her name is in that record. She filed a complaint knowing it would cost her something, and it did, and she did it anyway, and the record exists. That matters. The specific named, dated account of what happened in that operating room, what was said and by whom and in front of whom, is not something that time or reputation can reclassify. It's there. She sat in her car for 45 minutes, and then she filed the complaint. Harlan Mercer chose his word carefully, in a room where it would be heard, in a proceeding where it would be recorded. He chose it to convey something about the hierarchy he believed was real. What he found, in the 15 minutes that followed, was a different kind of real. That gap, between the hierarchy he had inhabited for 23 years and the authority that was actually in the room, is the space this case lives in. And understanding it, clearly, is worth more than any single verdict. Authority is not the same as power. The room that defers to you is not the same as the room that respects you. And the moment those two things become confused, the moment a person mistakes the deference of a surgical suite for the kind of authority that holds in every room they will ever enter, the gap becomes visible. In this case, it became visible at the exact moment a panel chair placed her pen on the table and said, without any particular emphasis, "Thank you, doctor." 2 words, the end of a question, the beginning of 15 minutes that changed what came next.